Hi, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about the EU Pay Transparency Directive and especially how it's affecting Swedish companies. And it is quite a daunting topic for many. I know that a lot of people are kind of afraid of this. What is this going to mean? We're here to help calm those nerves at least a little bit and make you a bit more prepared. So looking forward to bringing some positive energy to this and looking at some of the opportunities that this initiative actually brings as well. So that's exciting for us today. And of course, I'm not going to be the expert here. We are going to have Magnus talking about this topic. So, Magnus, would you like to introduce yourself and Peer as well?
Sure. Very nice to meet you all. My name is Magnus Strugell. I'm the CEO and founder of Peer. And Peer is a Swedish-based regulatory/impact SaaS company. So our purpose is basically to help close the global gender pay gap. So based in Stockholm, we do service our customers globally. So the software is used in more than, I think, 50 countries, and we survey about 3 million individuals each year and check for pay gaps and create actionable insights to help close the pay gaps. So that's sort of us. We're owned by Montero since this past summer, a growth fund, private equity growth fund here in Stockholm as well. So it's fun. It's a lot of fun. We're growing fast, and and we're truly very focused on helping our customers sort of prepare and meet this new directive that's going to come in 26. So
Yeah.
excited to be here. Thanks for having
We're
me.
really excited to have you with us. And of course, my name is Tove. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm usually the marketing team lead here at Jobylon, but moderating today. And for those of you who are new for us at Jobylon, we have a flexible talent acquisition platform and services mainly enterprise companies across the globe. And there's a lot of benefits to using us, but some of them is definitely that we have very beautiful and customizable job ads. We have a wide variety of recruitment marketing options, and it's also very easy to customize our platform to your specific needs. So that's a little bit about us at Jobylon as well. But today we're not talking about our companies, of course. We are going to utilize all of Magnus's expertise on this area, and we're going to talk about this new EU Pay Directive and Pay Transparency Directive. We're going to talk about what it means to Swedish companies. We're going to look at the implementation plan for that. We're going to talk about the challenges and opportunities that come with this. And then we're also going to touch upon how this initiative actually implicates or what implications we see on culture and DEI thanks to this initiative. So a lot of important topics to cover, and hopefully you get a lot of just inspiration and to-dos out of this that can help you move forward with this. This session is being recorded, so you'll receive the recording and the presentation afterwards. And of course, we welcome any and all questions. So use the chat, use the Q&A, take this opportunity to ask those questions that you might have in the back of your mind, kind of thinking, okay, I'll ignore this until it's time for me to focus on this. Use this time to ask those questions instead. And we'll have dedicated Q&A time towards the end of the session today. But let's get started. And Magnus, I mean, obviously, those of you who have signed up to watch this webinar, which I'm really happy to see so many with us live here today, they care. But in general, why should companies care about this? I mean, what are we really looking at here? Why is this important for people to actually focus on now?
Well, I would say that the whole it's a game changer, really. I mean, when we look at a lot of research, you know, how gender pay gap exists and what they consist of globally and also in Europe, of course, it's the main driver to close the pay gap is legislation. So one of the founding principles for the European Union back in 1958 was equal pay for equal work. It hasn't really happened for us. So the gender pay gap in all EU countries is around 13%. In Sweden, it's 11.2, and we've had, enforced legislation for 25 years. So it takes a lot of time. So now the Commission has basically said that, we're going to make salary setting transparent. So everyone will have the opportunity to understand what their pay is compared to their peers. We're also going to force companies to publish salary ranges, etc., just to sort of move away from the secrecy of salaries and make pay completely transparent. So it's a huge change to how candidates will view you as an employer. Within companies, it's going to be a lot of controversy because everyone's going to understand what their salaries compare to their peers. So it's a huge change, and it also comes with some reporting requirements, but it also comes with a lot of potential sanctions and lawsuits and fines from all the different governments across the EU. A big one is also that it's not a regulation. So GDPR was regulation. So all countries basically did the same, had the same legal framework to implement. Since this isn't a directive, it means that all 27 member states will basically implement this into local legislation differently. So everyone has a framework to sort of follow to meet the directive, but everyone's gonna be allowed to do it differently in a sense. So it's a
Exactly.
big one. It's a huge change for the EU for sure.
Definitely. And I mean, I think it's easy to look at, okay, you look at the baseline rules like we see here on screen, like companies over 250 employees to start off with, we'll get back to that, needs to directly adhere to this, right? But then we have, why should other companies care? So smaller companies, but actually, I mean, you're fighting for the same talent. You need to stay relevant. And if this is this sort of huge transformative change that we're going to see, it serves everybody to care about this. Or what do you say, Magnus?
Yeah, and we see this in for smaller companies, but we also see this with like Norway, who's not part of the European Union. We have a lot of Norwegian customers that are already preparing for the transparency legislation. They might not put it into legislation right away, but they basically believe that if the rest of Europe is actually publishing salary ranges and initial salaries for their positions, they need to follow suit in a sense. What's
Yeah.
also interesting with directive for smaller companies, even though you're below the 250 threshold, there are a lot of things in the directive that will actually hit smaller companies as well. So
Mm,
legislation will change, specifically in Sweden, we know this. So it's going to be a
yeah.
lot of work for smaller companies as well to really understand why they're paying what to each individual and be able to explain it basically as well.
Yeah. I mean, and that's, I think, a very good reason to care about this topic at all. So,
Yes.
to those of you who are with us today, great job. You already took the first step. You already care about the topic. I think that's great. We need to start somewhere, right? But before we get into Sweden's implementation plan, just to kind of review what does this new directive mean? I mean, we have a timeline, and we also have a goal of this one, right, Magnus? What are your
Yes.
quick overview of what this means?
Yes. So basically, the Parliament in the European Parliament has decided now, with the Commission and everything behind them, that finally they want equal pay for equal work in the European Union. So the aim is to basically reduce the current gender pay gap and also increase pay transparency across the union. This has to be implemented in local legislation by June 7th, 2026. So in Sweden, the law will actually commence June 1st, 2026.
Mm,
So it's a big change. It's a lot of information in this directive. I think that the Swedish piece from the government was over 300 pages long on how to implement this in Sweden. So there's a lot of legislative changes going on, I think,
mm,
across the EU around this for sure.
yeah. And I mean, today we are talking about how this affects Swedish companies. And as you mentioned, I mean, each country has their own plan for how to go about this. And if ours is 300 pages long, let's see how much we can condense it in this webinar.
Yes.
But we are going to take a look at the main things from the national implementation plan. And now this is where we really get down and dirty with what is actually happening and what do you actually need to be prepared for. So this is going to be really interesting. But let's go through these one by one or in groups, and then talk about how this is actually going to affect companies. So let's start with the salary structures that we see. What does this mean for companies, Magnus, and what are we requested to do here?
Yes. So basically, for the salary structures, it's different things. So whenever you recruit someone after June 1st, 2026, you will actually need to show your pay structure, meaning that in job adverts you need to either have the initial pay level for the position you're recruiting to, or you need to put out the initial salary range for that position. So that's one that's going to have a big effect. And for the Swedish legislation, they didn't take away. A lot of companies were hoping that they were going to take away some of the requirements around, the annual equal pay audits that we've had in Sweden for the past 25 years. That's still in. So what you need to do here is they just added a bunch of legislation on top of that. So you still need to do your annual equal pay audit if you're more than 10 employees. And then if you're more than 250 employees, you will do a transparency report as well. So you can think of it this way: if the pay structure, salary structure is kind of owned by HR and a select few managers right now, it's going to be on complete display after June 1st. So if you publish a salary range for a job advert, the individuals holding that position internally will see this pay range as well in the job advert. And we're going to come to that later, but they'll also be able to or be allowed to ask about their individual pay. So if they believe that they're positioned wrong in that pay range, they're definitely going to come and ask. So it's going to create a lot of tension, and also a lot of interest, and I think a lot of questions internally for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, when we talk about this, so the annual salary surveys, as you said, I mean, a lot of companies were probably hoping that they wouldn't have to do this. But are there any changes in how this reporting is being done? Is there anything that kind of differs with this new directive?
Yeah. So what they've done is they've kept the equal pay audit as is, but they've also included a new form that we're not quite sure exactly how they're asking companies to do. But you need to analyze persons that have been on parental leave compared to salary involvement of persons on parental leave compared to the ones that haven't been on parental leave. So that's one major change. That's like a fourth analysis going into the Swedish equal pay audits. That's one. The second one is that you need to prepare transparency reports and actually publish them or send them in to the
Yeah.
authorities annually. So that's a huge one. So every year you need to report on your gender pay gaps, your pay quartiles, your bonus gaps, etc., and publish or send them into the Diskrimineringsombudsman, the DO in Sweden, and they will publish it on their webpage. So whenever a candidate comes looking for a job at your company, they will most probably check your pay gaps. This is what has happened in the UK. We know this. It attracts a lot of attention. So especially females, but even males, will be able to compare your pay gaps to your peers
Yeah.
or your competitors, and they're going to be able to ask a lot of questions. If it's a high pay gap, you need to have your storyline in order just to be able to explain it, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And we got into a bit of the salary reporting and mapping.
Yes.
But when it comes to this, I mean, how are companies expected to do this in terms of just practical means? Because it sounds like
Yes.
a huge task to undertake and also quite an unstructured approach in terms of like you need to have this data, but how do we actually even gather the data? How do we
Yes.
make sure that we present it right?
Yeah. So if you're let's say that you're a Swedish-based company and you have more than 10 employees and you've actually complied with the current legislation, you're familiar on doing, the annual salary service or equal pay audits. That's fine, and you have to continue doing that. Then you will add a comparison for gender and parental leave as well, just to check for salary development. But then it's a complete new set of KPIs that you basically need to publish and send for the first. Well, right now you don't have to publish anything. You don't have to share anything with the government, but it will be mandated through the directive that each year companies with more than 250 employees to start with, this threshold would actually go down to 100 employees by 2030. So for the first 3 years, companies with more than 250 employees must report this transparency report to the Diskrimineringsombudsman in Sweden, and they will then publish your figures publicly for everyone to see. So what's included in that is basically your gender pay gap for base pay, and then your gender pay gap for variable pay and components. So any type of benefits, bonuses, company car, whatever you have to calculate the sum and then report that pay gap as well. You also need to report on the pay quartiles, and now it gets kind of detailed, but the pay quartile is basically the gender distribution for the lowest paid individuals in the company, which is 0 to 25th percentile, the lower middle quartile, which is 25th to median, and then median 75th and 75th to 100th percentile. So basically putting your gender distribution on display in terms of pay needs to be sent in as well. And then, of course, your total gender distribution as well.
Mm,
So that's all in here. But what you also need to do is you need to identify all the positions internally that have a pay gap wider than 5%. And
mm,
those positions you basically need to have an explanation what the pay gap consists of, if your gender neutral factors can explain the full pay gap or not. And that needs to be incorporated into the report that goes into the discrimination ombudsman in Sweden as well.
mm,
So it's a lot of analysis, it's a lot of explanations that you need to do. And
mm,
maybe one of the biggest ones is that if you're more than 250 employees, you also need to publish all your pay gaps for all your positions internally. And basically tell all your employees where they can find the data. So let's say that you have 60 positions internally. You need to publish both for equal and equivalent positions, the percentage differences of the female pay compared to the males. So again, if you publish this, which you will be forced to, and you're a female working in a position, you see that there's a pay gap, you're probably gonna wonder if you're paid fairly or not
mm.
compared to the males in that position. So it's a huge game changer in that sense, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a couple of questions here that I'm going to take. The first one is, what could we consider as gender neutral reasons? So, as you said, like the reason
Yes.
behind the pay
Yeah,
differences.
there's a number of them that's sort of confirmed and okay by the discriminators ombudsman in Sweden. So it's work-life experience. So let's say that a male, for instance, has 10-year longer work-life experience than a female. That could explain a certain portion of the salary difference. 10 years of time at the company, basically. So whenever you started, how many years you've been with the company. Time in role, if you're new in the role or not. Performance is a big one. It's
Mm,
usually used a lot as well. So if you're, if you're a high performer, you can always earn more than a low performer in the same position. And we can also add regional salary differences to this mix as well. So if you're based in Stockholm, you can earn more than someone based in, the islands or up north, for instance. So there are a number of sort of existing variables. But what's important with this directive is that it's very much tied to your own compensation policy. So if you
mm,
have salary setting criteria in the company, or if you have a compensation policy that, for instance, says that you're paying for competence, then you would need to include competence as one of your variables to check pay gaps for. So it's going
mm,
to be very tied to the individual company, and whatever you say that you want to pay a salary for needs to be in the analysis as well, incorporated into the analysis.
mm,
But those, I mean, those are sort of the factors you need to publish and need to send to the discrimination ombudsman, just showcasing, we have 15 positions with a pay gap wider than 5%. We can explain all 15 using these variables, and preferably, probably really in a granular fashion, showing exactly what explains what
mm.
on the different pay gaps, and then you should be fine.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We have another question here, which, yeah, a good question, which is, what about international companies? Would they still have to report on the pay discrepancies of their employees in Sweden?
Yes, if they're more than 250 employees. So it's on the legal entity. So, and this is also if you're an international company with headquarters in Stockholm or Sweden, you need to report on all different countries in the EU where you have more than 250 employees are going to have to file a separate country report. So this is also going to sort of play into the media, because we don't have to guess what's going to happen, because what happened was the UK basically has gender pay gap reporting legislation, came into effect 2017, 2018, all the companies started publishing their gender pay gaps. And that's basically with the same threshold. So if you're more than 250 employees, you need to publish this report and send it in annually to the government. So what basically happened is this media frenzy, right? So they can basically cover all companies, all different sectors, industries. The banking industry in the UK has a pay gap of 51%. Didn't look great. The big four has, I think, like 28% pay gap. So it's basically put on display, and media is all over because it's juicy, and they can write tons of articles. They can, pinpoint different companies, have shame lists. I mean, they can do a lot of this information, right?
Mm,
So if you're a multinational or international company, you will be forced to publish this across the EU in all different countries. But that's also opening up to media scrutiny, because let's say that you have a 5% pay gap in Sweden, and then you happen to have a 16% pay gap in Germany and a 0% pay gap in France, they're going to ask you if you're discriminating in Sweden and Germany, which you probably aren't, but they're still going to, play stupid and ask you, and you will need to be able to bring up the communication and sort of explain why you have higher pay gaps in Germany compared to Sweden, for instance, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah, a huge undertaking. But I also feel like having seen this and exactly what you're describing now in the UK, we have other countries, I mean, states in the US as well that has started doing this to a broad extent quite a few years ago. I mean, having the kind of benefit of looking into those countries and seeing what happened with still a year and a half to go until this legislation actually takes place, I feel like that at least gives some sort of advance notice on what to expect, which I'm guessing
For
is good
sure.
to some extent. Nice.
Yeah,
We
there's
are,
still time.
yeah, there's still time. It's good. It's a good takeaway so far in this webinar. There's a lot to do, but there's still time. Now, when it comes to information, so you touched upon this a little bit, but let's
Yes.
talk about sort of what job seekers or candidates, but also what employees actually have the right to know in these circumstances or with this directive.
Sure. So, I mean, this is one of the biggest changes in terms of transparency. So, if you're a company, whenever you recruit, you need to inform a potential candidate about the starting salary before they actually show up for the first interview. So, you actually need to ensure that they know what the pay is for the position somehow. I mean, you don't need to publish it, but you need to call them up and inform them, preferably in written or in writing, what the salary band is or what the starting salary is for the position. So they should know this before they actually come for the first interview. Also, it will be forbidden for managers or employers to ask about any type of salary history. So you're not going to be allowed to ask the very common question, what's your pay today? What are you expecting for the future, etc. And that's actually, I think, the number one of the legislators have really looked at science and research in terms of how to close a pay gap. And the reasoning why they put this into the directive is that it's very common that males tend to exaggerate their pay in an interview situation. So if they're asked a question, they might say, if they have 50, they say that they have 60 right now. And a female is going to be more truthful and she's going to say 52. And then the male will end up with a 65 and she'll end up with potentially 57. So you will sort of carry on your discriminated salary with you from job to job. So that's why they're stopping this. So you're not going to be allowed to ask. You're going to have to rely on that the salary ranges you have and the salary structure you have are attractive enough to take the top talent into your company in a sense. So that's one. If you're a current employee, you are actually going to be able to access information. So one, you're going to be able, if you're more than 250 employees, you're going to be able to see all the different gender pay gaps broken down by position and gender, equal and equivalent positions across the company. That's one. But also you're going to be allowed to ask your employee about your pay. So from June 1st, 2026, anyone in Sweden will be allowed to go and ask, your manager or HR what your pay is compared to your peers in equal and equivalent positions. And then the employer needs to answer this within 2 weeks and sort of give you a report saying that, the mean pay for your position is 40K. You're at, 36, so you're training by 10%, and that's due to, and then they have to give you the gender neutral factors such as performance or work-life experience or time enrolled, etc., etc. So again, if you're in a position, you see that there's a pay gap, you're allowed to go and ask. You're probably going to go and ask HR or your manager. I saw that there's a pay gap. What's my pay compared to my peers? And then they will be forced to share this. So we're really moving into full transparency here, in a
Mm.
sense. And also, of course, the Swedish lönekartläggning or equal pay audit needs to be communicated, or the results needs to be communicated to all employees, to workers' representatives, and then the transparency report will be sent into the EU. So it's going to be different. It's going to be very difficult to hide anything. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, definitely sounds like it. And I guess from a employee standpoint, this is amazing. But from an employer standpoint, it does require quite a lot. But
Yes,
yeah.
for sure.
We are getting quite a lot of questions. I'm gonna save those for the Q&A, so don't think that I'm ignoring them. Those of you who are asking. Next and last part that we're gonna go through here is, of course, what happens when you don't actually live up to this. So, Magnus, what are the repercussions if you don't actually fulfill
Yes.
these demands?
Sure. So if we start with the bottom one there, so there are two new forms of sanctions that will be included into the Swedish discrimination legislation. So all countries will do different things here, but in Sweden, it's basically put into the legislation that if you don't provide the transparency report to Diskrimineringsombudsman, it's going to be a sanction fee. So you're going to sanction and you're going to get that fee regardless, but you need to send them the report basically. That's one. If you sort of ignore your duties around transparency, the full burden of proof, if there are any disputes or any discussions, or if you get sued by any employee, for instance, that believe that there's gender discrimination, the full burden of proof will shift to you as an employer. That's one. And then there's also the risk of compensation. So what they've written into the legislation in Sweden is that a workers' representative, so a union, can basically put forward a claim against an employer for all their members. So this is sort of the first time where we'll have almost like class action lawsuits where a union might believe that you as an employer is not following suit, is not doing the equal pay audit correctly, that there is a gender effect in terms of pay, and then they're actually allowed to sue you. And then, of course, you as an employer need to defend yourself. They made a change. So in Sweden, it's going to be the regular courts. So tingsrätt is going to handle this, not going to be the Arbetsdomstol as it's been previously. So now it's going to be in the public eye as well, because that's all public information. And if you were to lose a lawsuit, either against a certain one individual or a group of individuals, then there will be a right to back pay, so recovery pay as a compensation for this breach. And that's just not the base pay, it's also benefits and everything. What they did put, so previously we haven't had a limitation in Swedish legislation, so it could basically be 20 years backwards for recovery pay, but now they've set that the limitation is a period of 3 years. So from the date an employee basically makes a claim, it's basically 3 years backwards you need to pay up if you were to lose such claim. But I mean, the legal part is quite invasive as well compared to how we're used to handling these types of cases in Sweden, for sure.
Yeah. A lot of changes coming for companies. And what is your experience? I mean, talking about the sanctions and the legal procedure in general, this is, of course, one of the biggest fears with GDPR was that companies would
Yeah.
end up in these sort of situations where they have to pay a lot of money. What's your view of companies now focusing on this? Because you're already working with a lot of companies on this, obviously,
Yes.
here. What's their view on these sanctions and
Well, I
risks?
think the sanction fees are going to be fairly easy to stay away from. It's just basically submit your report and you're not going to get sanctioned, which is it's a gimme basically.
Yeah.
In terms of sort of the compensation or the right to compensation and back pay, I think what most of our customers are doing is they're basically analyzing their data now. They're making sure that they can explain all their pay gaps. Historically, we've done most of the equal pay auditing in Sweden on median pay. For the pay directive, it's mean, which means that the gaps usually widens with the mean salary instead of the median salary. So they're analyzing this from a median perspective, mean perspective. They're spending a lot of money to close gaps so that they're ready by June 1st, 2026. So they're basically ensuring that they can explain all their individuals, they can explain all the pay gaps prior to the commencement of the legislation. So that they're actually going to be able to supply a right to information report or, be able to, and they're also really working closely with the unions because they don't want the unions against them once this happens.
No.
And we also know, I mean, we see that some of the, without mentioning names, but we see that some of the unions are really understanding the future rights that they will have when this transparency directive comes. So they're already pushing quite hard to get more data and see more analysis, understand more of the pay gaps, etc. So it is an opportunity now if you can collaborate with them more in depth already, I think the risk of you being sued through a collective claim is going to go down
Yeah.
immensely. So you can mitigate the risks already.
Yeah, and I mean that's more good news, right? If you again starting early, it's positive.
Yeah,
But
you can do it.
you can do it. But we have so more questions keep coming in. I love that you're so active. Shows that this topic is really top of mind for all of you. There's one that I want to take right away since we're on this anyways. So the 13% gender pay gap that you mentioned, Magnus, it's typically calculated by comparing the average pay for all working men to that of all working women. And then this comment says nearly all of the difference comes from three main factors. So career choices, number of hours worked, and sick leave. So are the EU regulations planning on addressing these factors as well? Are they addressing it
Yeah.
in some way?
They are in a sense. So basically, what you have to be cautious about when we talk about gender pay gaps, it's always the unadjusted pay gaps, to your
Yeah.
point. So the unadjusted pay gaps are roughly 13%. And then we try to adjust it and we look at, part-time, full-time, private versus public sector, etc. So the whole directive is basically aiming for you to be able to explain all the gaps, right? So so if you have an unadjusted pay gap of 10% in a position, if you can adjust that pay gap using these gender neutral factors down to zero, then you've basically explained the gap and then you're fine. So what the directive aims to do is if you have the 10% pay gap, you can only adjust, let's say 7%, then 3% remains, which
Mm,
means that if you pay up the salary difference for a female and increase the salary, so that 3% is actually paid up, then the gap is closed and you don't have any discrimination anymore. So
mm,
the whole analysis methods around the pay gaps are completely driven by that, in terms of first you have the raw pay gap, then you adjust it. After adjustment, if it still exists, then you need to do something about it in a sense.
mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so now we've talked through this, what is, as you mentioned earlier, Magnus, a 300-page implementation plan, and we've tried to get it down to brass tacks in terms of what you actually need to do. But, and I mean, we've alluded to this, right? Why should you focus on this already? And revisiting that timeline, it's June 2026, seems like a long time away, a long time to go, but time moves fast and there's a lot of things that need to be done as you've seen from the previous slides. So let's talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that come with this and kind of how you can mitigate that. And a lot of it comes down to you should probably care already. So let's talk about the challenges first, and then we'll go into the more positives from this as well. I'm gonna click up all of these, Magnus, and then we can talk about them. So what do you see as kind of the main challenges here, apart from maybe that the timeline is shorter than you may think?
Yeah, I think that's key in a sense because a lot of companies see 2026 and now it's 24 and they believe that they have all the time in the world, but it really only is a year and a half away before any employee can come and ask about their pay.
Mm,
So just putting that in retrospect, and you really only have one or two salary reviews left before the salary system will be on display as well. So if you have huge pay gaps and if you have a lot of pay gaps that you cannot explain and you need to start paying up, it's better to do it over 2 years rather than 1 year, I would say. That's one. I think one of the biggest challenges we see that most companies have are around the job architecture.
mm,
And what's an equal position? What's an equivalent position? Are we sure that we can, do we have the right data in place? Can we actually pull all the data we need in terms of variable components and pay, for instance? So there are tons of things that you should start doing. And I think, it takes a lot of time, even if you have our software or competitor software, you need to allocate resources
mm,
and start finding out what your baseline is and also just starting to do the work. Because a year and a half goes by really fast. So
yeah. And would you say, I mean, today, would you say that companies are aware of their gender pay gaps, or are they just kind of fumbling in the dark to try to find this data to begin with?
yeah, I think larger companies in Sweden, so large companies more than 250 employees, a lot of them have done some sort of equal pay auditing. They either
Mm,
do it in Excel or they do it like the full circle way. So I think they're kind of aware of it.
Mhm.
But again, it's been on the median salaries and not mean salaries, which has quite a big impact.
Mm.
Some of them do very thoroughly, some of them hardly do it. So I would say that probably about 60-70% have some sort of equal pay audit as a baseline, and they know that, they do it annually and they try to correct salaries, etc. So I think Sweden is better prepared than most other European countries because we've had this legislation for so long, in a sense. But for the first time, there's huge financial, to your point, there's huge financial reputational risk. I don't think the financial risk is that big. Let's say that you have, 10, 15, 20 employees that might be discriminated, and, you'll end up having to pay them, 500,000 kroners extra in fines and compensation. Most companies of size can take that. However, the reputational risk
Yeah.
of you being in the papers, you being sued at court, means that you basically are gonna neglect 50% of the talent pool, because no females are ever going to apply to you ever again, because they believe that you are an employer that discriminates, right? And a lot
Yeah.
of males aren't going to apply either, because they believe in fairness and they believe that, an equal society, etc., etc. So the reputational risks are much, much higher, I think, than the financials, really. So you don't want to end up on the shame list. You don't want to end up being sued in public courts so anyone can read about it. It's a lot of risks in terms of that. But again, if you prepare and you're aware of your pay gaps and you can explain them and you've done all the internal work, then you're off the hook. You're fine. I mean, you're allowed to have pay gaps. It's just that you need to be able to communicate and need to explain them in a
Mm.
correct way.
And I mean, Magnus, from my own personal view, so I, alongside many people in different industries, follow along with companies like Albright, for example, do an
Yeah.
annual survey of companies, and they focus a lot on the gender pay gap and what's happening, what's not happening, and they do have kind of a shame list already, especially with like the worst company of the year. But has that actually changed anything? Like if I
No.
try to be positive about this, but if we go to the more negative side, since we are under challenges, your honest belief, will this be kind of the tipping point where this actually makes a change that is long lasting, or will we end up kind of in the same situation year by year where companies are still doing this, but they're kind of just not thinking about it, or not just kind of blazing over it
Yeah.
going forward anyways?
I think the impact will be much greater than GDPR, for instance, because we always get asked that. GDPR came and, everyone was worried, blah, 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 nothing really happened. But that's sort of privacy. Most people really don't care if you're in a salary, and if you're in your database somewhere for an online retailer that you shop, 5 years ago. I don't really care, at least. So I think to that point. But what we've seen in the UK, for instance, we've seen some of the big four firms, they have 30% less female applicants now than prior to the gender pay gap being, presented, because they're very bad at explaining the pay gap. So if they have a 28% pay gap, they get asked questions by the media, why do you have a pay gap? They usually very bluntly say it's because we only have 8% female partners. And then the follow-up question is, why is that? And they say, because females don't want to be partners here, which is of course not accurate. But they don't have a good work-life balance, and they don't create the processes for females to actually have a career and family at the same time.
No.
So all that is going to most probably hit, Sweden and all the other European countries as well, where you're going to be able to compare data. You're going to get a lot of questions, especially if you do cross-nation comparisons. So again, if you have, Volvo trucks in Sweden has X%, and then they have another percent in Belgium, another percent in Germany. The media will play stupid. They will play that they don't understand this, and they will ask questions such as, you have a 22% pay gap, you must discriminate females. And
Mm.
then, someone in HR or comms needs to reflect on this and be very smart when they respond to it. So
Mm.
it has a bigger sort of social value than GDPR in a sense. And
Mm.
it will most probably drive down the pay gaps, because just by all the companies we work with and our competitors work with now, it's a huge interest in actually starting to analyze the gaps. And that's entirely driven by this directive. So all of a sudden, everyone is worried, and all of a sudden, everyone is actually analyzing their data and actually doing a lot of salary increases. So of course it's going to have an impact, I think, in the short and in the long term as well.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's the
Yeah, hopefully. I
best
mean,
answer we could hope for, I guess.
if this doesn't work, then I don't know. Then we can give up, I guess.
Yeah.
That's
Oh, that's so sad. Don't say that.
no, we won't.
Yeah.
We will.
No, I'm kidding, Magnus. No, but great. We still have a few things to cover before we go into the Q&A, but in terms of opportunities, I mean, most of these we have touched upon. But of course, preparation, being able to take this data-driven approach, what's kind of your takeaway in terms of opportunities that companies actually have? Like why, if you
Yeah.
act early now, what do you gain?
I think the main one is, and I mean, we speak to companies every day around this, and a lot of them believe that this is sort of almost like a punishment from the European Union. You know, they get really upset and they say, you know, not more legislation. This will sort of kill us off in the competition against, you know, Asia and the US that don't care about this. You know, why are they doing this to us? Blah, 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 blah. However, if you instead embrace this and you see this as an opportunity, if you are the first company in your sector, for instance, that
Mm,
actually publishes their gender pay gaps publicly before the directive commences, if you start publishing your gender pay gaps internally before the directive commences, if you start putting, you know, salary ranges into job adverts a year ahead of time, you will stand out as the best, you know, most inclusive, most modern type of employer there is. And you will basically mitigate all risks of any employees believing they're discriminated because you're going to be completely transparent before you have to be transparent.
mm,
So if you're quick enough and if you have good data and you can analyze your data and you see that the risks are very low in terms of a low pay gap or that you can fully explain all your pay gaps, then you might as well get ahead of the curve and start communicating this much, much sooner than everyone else.
mm.
And it is a war for talent. So if you do this, you're going to be probably seen as the most attractive employer there is, at least in your field or in your sector, and you're going to be able to attract top talent that view this as very, very important, right, for the future.
Exactly. And I think, I mean, considering how difficult it is to find top talent and how important talent attraction in general is, even if hiring has slowed down, that means you're looking for very specific talent, and those are sometimes even more difficult to
Yeah.
find. So very, very important. Something that is also an opportunity and kind of leads us into the next topic here is that being this transparent can actually improve your employee retention. So as you said, I mean, your employees having felt that the company is transparent about this, they do feel that they want to stay for longer and they are more engaged. And that brings us into the impact on culture and DEI, because I mean, while this directive aims to close the gender pay gap, DEI, of course, includes lots of other factors than just gender. But let's take a look at how this is actually supposed to affect, because since we have countries where this has already been implemented, we actually have data on what we can expect from this. And spoiler alert, it is very positive. So let's take a look at it. But I think, first of all, we really need to take a look at the current landscape and kind of review where we're at when it comes to DEI and culture. And when it comes to pay inequality, diversity is still very much a significant part of this. Why do we have a pay inequality? It's not just gender, but it's other factors as well. It is harder to get hired based on different types of factors. And once you do actually get hired, your pay may not reflect the same pay as your peers. And what we also know, which is an important factor here, is that culture and brand reputation is a huge, huge attraction part for today's talent market. Now we know that Gen Z, they care more about corporate social responsibility, they care more about DEI initiatives than previous generations, but they also affect older generations in terms of what they should be caring for. So important to note here is also that this doesn't only affect their sort of them in the perspective as a talent or as a candidate for a job, but it also affects their buying habits. So your brand reputation is not just your employer brand, but also your brand in general is affected by this, which I think is a very important factor to keep in mind. And then what we can also see is that this is listed as an increasingly important part for both candidates and employees, outright pay transparency. So not just transparency in general, what's happening, what's the process like when you're a candidate, what's the structures for being promoted, for example, internally, but actual requirements on pay transparency is really high on the list. And one of the facts that I think really drive this home is that studies have shown that internal talent are more likely to switch jobs to a competitor if the only difference is pay transparency is more obvious. Like they have a more fair pay or more obvious pay transparency. They're more transparent with what they do in terms of compensation. The candidates don't even need to get paid more. They switch anyways because they actually value this so high. And I think that that's something that companies should really take to heart, because if you are, like you were in talking about just a second ago, Magnus, but actually having that transparency, actually keeping your employees engaged and knowing that your company actually care, it is really important. And withholding obviously has the opposite effect. So I think that's something that we need to care about. But if we then talk about the new directive and how that implicates this, or how this changes the landscape here, first of all, it really levels the playing field. I mean, in a way that we haven't seen before. And even though, as I was talking about in Sweden, we have had legislation on this, we have talked about this, we have studies being made every year on which companies are doing good or bad. But the transparency still hasn't been there, right? It's always been somebody has to do some sort of deep digging journalistic investigation to figure out what's going on, and companies don't want to be forthcoming with this data. But now they have to be. So this really levels the playing field. And the good part, which is what I think is really, really important to recognize here, is that it affects other parts of diversity as well. So even though we might think that, yes, we get stuck in talking about diversity as gender, and we tend to do that because it's easier to measure, especially here in Sweden, we tend to do that. And this directive is again focusing on the gender pay gap for the same reasons. We will see an improvement regardless of which diversity factors we're including in this. That's what we've seen from other countries, which is really, really positive for diversity as a whole, of course. And I also think that one of the things that are critical that we haven't seen before, which a lot of people tend to miss with this directive, I think, is that we're finally actually addressing intersectional diversity. So people are more than just one thing. You can be discriminated against, you can be, disqualified for things based on more factors than just one. So you could have your gender and your ethnicity working against you, for example, in the labor market. And this is finally addressed here. So we're getting to a point where actually we've been talking about this for a long time, but it feels like we're finally making sort of strides forward with this initiative, and it's going to affect more parts than just gender, which is great. And when we talk about this, what I really want to get to here, which I think is critical for all of you listening, is of course, this is going to affect your bottom line. Regardless of what you choose to do, this is going to affect your bottom line. It's going to affect your retention. It's going to affect your talent attraction. It is going to affect your brand reputation, both towards your customers, be it businesses or consumers, but also your talent pools. And we also know from research that diversity actually improves your market research value, the way that you actually make business decisions. All of those things are more effective, more well researched when you look at diverse teams and the value of diversity. So if we work with this, we can actually kind of fulfill several goals at the same time, which is a really critical part. So if you're not driven by pay transparency as such, you might be driven by DEI questions. And if you are, then I mean, these go really, really, really closely in hand. Yeah, it's an important part to keep in mind, and one that this discussion don't always focus on, but it was important for us to bring this up. Now, we've talked about what implementation will look like. We've talked about challenges, we've talked about opportunities, we've focused on DEI and culture. What can companies do today? What should they be doing today? And then we'll go into the Q&A. Magnus, quickly now, what are top
Yes,
three things
very
that
quickly.
companies should do now?
So you should definitely start reviewing your organization. So what we're seeing is that a lot of companies, even if you have a job architecture or some old organizational structure somewhere, you need to review it. Because if you don't have a good job architecture and you don't have clear, equal positions, equivalent positions, it's going to be very difficult to understand your pay gaps and even understand if you have an issue or not. So that's almost like starting point, get your job architecture or your org structure right. Analyze your data. You need to understand your baseline. You should have already understood your baseline. If you haven't started, do it now. You only have a year and a half, 2 salary revisions to correct things. So really, really start understanding what the pay gaps look like. And it might not be an issue. That's the thing. We always look at this as, oh, it's a huge issue, but if you actually look at the data, you might be fine. And you're not going to be, you're going to be able to be relieved and, you're going to be able to meet this without a problem, basically.
Mm.
And I think the third one is this one. Make sure that you inform your C-suite and really ensure buy-in from them, because the board of directors needs to understand this. The C-level needs to understand this because it comes with a lot of ramifications. So if you're not prepared June 1st, 2026, and the chairman of your board will have to be in the media explaining him or herself, it's not going to be very popular. So you just have to ensure that they understand the ramifications of the Pay Transparency Directive so that you can actually get the funds you need and the attention you need to make it happen, in a sense.
Very, very good summary there of what we've
Yeah.
talked about, but also pinpointing the most important parts. And I see we get more and more questions. It's really fun. But after this, you'll get the full recording and presentation, but you'll also get early access to our Jobylon's new trend guide for 2025. And in this report, we, of course, have a section for pay transparency, as that's a huge part. And in that, you'll also find a lot of resources that can help you move forward. We'll also include some other resources in the sendout so that you have some information from peers, some guides on what to do, etc. So it's a really good resource email to look out for in your inbox after this. But let's talk questions, or let's look at the questions that we have. So let's see. So when it comes to questions about earlier pay, Magnus, what will happen for recruitment companies? What happens if you, for example, ask, what are you basing your salary demands on to a candidate?
That's a good question. I think, well, since we are doing a lot of recruitment work with external providers, and they believe that they are still going to be allowed to ask because they're not the employer asking, right? It's a sort of third-party vendor asking, what's your salary expectations? That's one. But on the other hand, since everyone will be publishing the initial salary levels or the salary ranges, it's actually going to improve recruiting processes, because you're not going to get candidates applying for a job believing it's going to pay them 60K when you are, as a company, are prepared to pay 45K. So you're actually going to get more qualified candidates to all the positions you're applying for. But for now, I mean, they're not technically the employers. I guess they're free to ask, but I think more and more candidates are going to, not going to reveal it. They're just going to say, that has no impact on my future choice of employer, right? I believe that the salary range is what I'm happy with, and that's why I'm here, basically, for the job, in
Yeah.
a sense.
Very, very good. And when it comes to, oh, this is a good one. What about the individual's right to privacy? If there's
Yes.
not too many people with a similar role, the individual's salary is all of a sudden known to anyone who's interested. Does this new directive take that into account?
Well, we are hoping that they will stipulate this in the actual legal text of
Mm,
the amendments to the Swedish discrimination legislation. Because to that point, let's say that there's only 3 individuals in a position, 1 female and 2 males, and the female comes and asks, even if you get it indexed as a percentage, she's gonna be able to calculate backwards what the pay is for the position,
yeah.
which is again against the law, but it's gonna be very so. I think, but you can also put it, I think, in your compensation policy so that we do not reveal individual salaries if it's less than 5 or 6 individuals in a position, for instance. Then we do it on the equivalent level. So we do the individual salary compared to all the other salaries for the equivalent level in the organization, for instance. So there are workarounds, but it's going to be very, very interesting to see what they actually put into the final legal text on this one.
Yeah, for sure. And we had another question along the same lines, but a company with 20 to 30 employees, do they have to show all salaries for all employees?
No. Well, they need to show it to the workers' representatives through the equal
Yeah.
pay audit if you're more than 10 employees. But they don't need to publish the gender pay gaps for the different positions internally.
Mm,
However, anyone in that company are allowed to ask about their pay compared to their peers.
yeah.
So again, if you have three individuals in a position, it's going to be difficult. But if you have, eight employees at the same level, then you will need to share something with the employee in terms of index salaries, what's the percentage difference, et cetera,
Mm, mm,
divided up by gender. So
exactly. Okay, but that makes sense. We also have another question that I saw somewhere here. Yes, how different is Sweden's plan compared to other European countries? I think that's a really fun one.
yeah, we have an ambitious one as always.
Yeah.
No, we're the only country out of the member states that have actually published what we're going to do. So
Oh,
everyone else is following suit. But I think Germany came out swinging and they said they're going to implement this faster than in 2026. So they're looking at parts of the directive to be implemented in 25 around transparency. So, the right to information, et cetera, but not maybe the transparency reporting.
mm,
Belgium was second a few weeks back, and they've basically put out stipulations for publicly owned companies with at least 250 employees, and that's all around transparency reporting as well. So Finland, I think, is going to publish in March how they're going to implement this. Spain is going to do it now before New Year's. Portugal is doing it second quarter 25. So everyone is sort of running their own legislative agenda here around the EU, and some of them already have legislation, like France have gender pay gap legislation. So a lot of them do have some sort of legislation that they're probably just going to tweak and improve, I guess, in a sense, to improve the transparency part of it. Uh,
yeah. But interesting to follow along then and see what they
yeah, we can have a sort of an update webinar in like a year's time, and we can tell you what the different countries are going to do.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, on that point, because we're gonna round this off, I see that we have some more questions. Feel free to reach out afterwards if you didn't get your question answered here. But we are running out of time. But we will have some fun announcements going forward as well, and maybe even some in-person meetups to discuss this topic going forward together with Jobylon and Peer. So keep an eye out for that, and we'll continue the discussions obviously throughout the next year. Very nice.
Great.
Thank you so much, Magnus, for being here today and
Thank you,
answering
guys.
all the
Thank you to all
questions.
the participants as well.
Yeah,
A lot
thank
of
you so
fun.
much to all of those of you who joined in. And as I said, if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out afterwards. We'll get back to you with the recording and a lot of information that you can use going forward. Thank you so
Great.
much, and I hope you have a lovely day, all of you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye bye.